was actually a general. He participated in the wars themselves, and so what he wrote was firsthand knowledge of the conflict, even though he wrote it down much later. The evolution of specialized journalism, especially journalism connected with active conflict, developed actually with, of course, the printed word. So the next really prominent journalists didn't appear until the 1600s, 1650. A Dutch journalist identified himself by renting a small boat and going into the middle of the British and Greek, British and Dutch warships to cover the battle. And that account of the battle, which he wrote, appeared in the Times of London. And so guess what? All of a sudden, journalists are going out to cover wars, and the next big coverage that appeared in the Times of London was Napoleon's campaign in Spain, which was covered by British journalists who actually went to the battlefield. Our friend Winston Churchill in 1899 was a war correspondent before he was a soldier. So the idea of journalism and war, kind of go hand in hand. The last half of the 20th century saw kind of a difference between, I guess you would say, major war coverage and minor war coverage. The war in Kosovo, the war for the liberation of Kuwait were major events, but nothing compared to the size of the war between Iran and Iraq. And yet, the liberation of Kuwait received much more coverage over a longer period of time than the Iran-Iraq war. Now, in terms of the public's attitude towards war correspondence and the military's attitude toward war correspondence, we have two very different experiences in the United States at the end of the 20th century. That is Vietnam and the liberation of Kuwait and Iraq in the 1990s. So in the Vietnam era, journalists were looked upon as activists. They were looked upon as investigators. They were looked upon as troublemakers. And the military believed that part of the reason why the Vietnam War didn't result in an increase in their prestige was because the journalism was against the war. The journalism was investigating rather than informing on the activities of the military. So when the liberation of Kuwait came around in 1990, the military took a completely different attitude. In Vietnam, the war correspondents, the journalists were allowed free rein, and they exposed war in all its horrible forms to the American public. In the liberation of Kuwait in 1990, the military carefully boxed up the journalists, and so journalists were not allowed to enter Iraq freely. They were embedded with military units so that they could inform, but they were under a really tight rein in terms of how they reported. So the journalism coming out of that tended to be, and I think probably the military, you can see the military was right, the journalism tended to be much more positive, much more supportive of American military activity than had taken place interestingly, the role of journalists, and particularly the role of war correspondents, is actually mentioned in the Geneva Convention of 1949, where war correspondents are granted the same rights as civilians in the conflict. And that, of course, is a major issue coming down through all of the war correspondent situations. So just with that kind of background, now we have three incredible practitioners of this art of journalism during war. And I guess we'll just have to start out with Mr. Jelinić down there at the end, so we don't, well, he's on my right-hand side, so that's probably good. So will you start us off, please? We're going to have 10 minutes each, or approximately 10 minutes each, of statements by the panelists, and then I'll ask a series of questions to kind of get your juices flowing, and then we'll let you ask questions of the panelists. So please.
So, good morning, everybody. I'm very glad to be here, and in this 10 minutes, I'll try to highlight the activities of the Nacional in the late 90s, covering the war in Croatia and later on the happenings and war in Bosnia. In terms of technology, there were no internet, the things were not so not so fast as nowadays, but the basics remain the same. We questioned a lot of things that took place, but nothing was reported at the time. So we basically unveiled the parallel level of politics in Croatia at the time, which fueled the approach to the war both in Croatia and in Bosnia, that deeply reflected on general politics in Bosnia and deeply influenced the integration of Croatia towards the EU. So at the time, Croatia was facing the aggression from Serbia, and it was more or less clear situation. We covered all sorts of events, bombing on the occupied territory on Croatia, and what we basically concentrated on is to highlight wrongdoings from within and the treatment of the civilians throughout the war and the unpleasant activities towards the Serbian minorities at the time in Croatia. So there were quite a few atrocities taking place, done by the Croatian military circles and Croatian police circles, and it created a lot of pressure towards the journalists, because not only the fall down of Yugoslavia as it was the fall down of the system of the journalism that was on the scene for decades. So Nacional was a new outlet at the time, and we introduced at the time, we were not the only one. Before us, there was Globus Weekly. We came out of this Globus Weekly split on Globus and Nacional, and we basically introduced in-depth investigating reports what was going on the field. So there were some things that nobody wanted to know, nobody wanted to see at the time, because of the general atmosphere that we were attacked, that we are fighting for the independence. But we at the time, in parallel, we basically highlighted some killings of the Serbs and immigrants. And I have published secret reports with the photos, because of one killed family in the heart of Zagreb, which is capital of Croatia, nothing to do with the war activities. So people basically disappeared. So those photos were carefully hidden from the public. We basically obtained the photos which shed some light on it. It led to that the then Prime Minister, Mr. Sanader, decided to compensate the damages to the family a couple of years after. So, this was one example. And of course, we were questioned why we are doing this. What's the reason for it? You know, when it's wartime, and you are under attack. It's a lot of people tend to make things more simple, not to question what's going on behind. What I would like to point out as the probably most important contribution of Nacional as a magazine is the covering of the events in Bosnia in terms of the role that Croatian politics had in Bosnian conflict, especially when we talk about the investigation on war crimes committed by the Croatian forces in Bosnia. There's famous Ahmići case. There is famous parallel line of military commanders within the Croatian forces, which we basically shed light on at the time. So it created a lot of influence on general politics, because we highlighted that there were some circles within the Croatian policymakers who fueled the war in Bosnia, who trying to fuel the war between the Muslims and Croats at the time. And we also published some Secret Service reports to inform public who really committed crimes, for instance in Ahmići. And it influenced a lot the Hague processes, especially in case of General Blašković. Not so much in terms of that he was innocent at all, but he was cleared around for 85% of charges after we published those secret reports. But it was important in terms that there were a line within Croatian politics at the time who was very keen to hide the war criminals. They were right-wing oriented, and they were a very distinguished member of the intelligence, of military service. So this was basically the process that enlightened the Croatian political scene from within. There were two lines: those radical guys who tried to cover up the war events, and that they would lead Croatia in international isolation. And there were also guys from within the HDZ, then ruling party, who basically provided us with those kind of reports. They wanted Croatia to move towards the EU integration. And the roles of those gentlemen who did also very important political work and were highly within the political circles, was very brave at the time. Mm-hmm. They were also, they contributed a lot on the media scene as well. So they were credible sources. We obtained a lot of secret information, and we shed some light on it. And it made a great influence. There was most probably the key case in this regard was the General Gotovina case. He was hard refugee. We basically found General Gotovina while he was running away from Hague. We made an interview with him, and he basically stated that he is willing to cooperate with Hague, but he was not permitted not even to talk to the Hague investigators, because the policymakers didn't allow it. They were very selective in that regard. They allowed some journalists to speak with the investigators. They didn't allow him to do so. So it created a lot of tension, and this case of General Gotovina itself strongly influenced the Croatian accession to the EU. If it wasn't for this case, there's a strong belief that Croatia would be accepted to the EU back in 2007, not to wait another 6 years. So we did a lot of this work. We were under a lot of pressure. There was some book published about this by the journalist from Nacional. But this was the clear line what we did throughout the past 2 decades. The danger is always the same. Whether it's the first throw of grenades, or whether it's the battle itself, or whether it's the battle to enlighten what's going on from behind. I will stop here for the
So the journalist as a political activist, not just informing but trying to influence the situation. Okay, David, can you give us an opening statement?
Sure. Can you all hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah, great. So I've actually come here. I went from Ukraine to Israel, one day in London to here, which is why I'm not smartly dressed as these people. So I want to talk about essentially what I've learned, I think, from both conflicts, and then the role of the journalist within that. So I went to Ukraine in 2014, which is when the war started. I know you know this, but a lot of people say when the war started last year, and I say, well, actually it's been going for 9 years, because a lot of people died before that. Now, I covered war a little bit before. I was in the Congo in 2010, embedded with the UN peacekeepers, and we went into the jungles near Bunia, near these rather disgusting group called the North Resistance Army, that I'm sure you've heard of. And I remember going into Ukraine, and I mean, so I'm a little bit like Jonah, right? Ever I go descends to disaster. It's not really my fault. I went to Lebanon in 2009 for 1 week to interview Hariri, the president, and the government collapsed and we fled to Paris. So I went to Ukraine in 2014 to cover the aftermath of Maidan. And then a week later, war broke out. And I stayed for a year, actually. And in 2015, I'd had enough, and I went to Greece, the financial crisis broke out. It's another story. But the point is, I went to Ukraine in 2014, and I was in the occupied cities, so these cities that have been under occupation now for 10 years, or 9 years, Donetsk, Luhansk. And, you know, I was there the second night that these buildings were seized. If you may or may not remember, but the Russians came in, they stole Crimea. You know, the little green men, as they called them, walked in with no identifying insignias. Everyone knew they were Russians, but because they didn't have those Russian flags, everyone could pretend they didn't know who they were and ignore it. And then I saw, you know, then we had these sort of so-called separatist movements in the East that were obviously Russian-sponsored things, and I was there on the first day. You saw people with masks, baseball bats. They ripped up paving stones and used them to sort of, and they barricaded themselves in the building. And then, just coincidentally, I was in Slaviansk the night that they took the police station, and that's when I saw the other men, and that I dated the actual beginning of this war coming up, and when everything kind of switched to an all-out invasion of Eastern Ukraine, even if it wasn't everything but name only. And what struck me is that at the time, and I think we still have this in the West, is that we have this particular idea of what war is. And I think, you know, and especially if you're British and American, I think, but obviously, you know, European as well. You know, the Second World War, someone said once that, you know, the underlying morality tale of the West used to be Christianity, now it's World War II, and I think that's probably something to be said about that. We have this vision of war, right? World War II, which is there are two sides, both wear uniforms, they have fights, you know, in battlefields that are essentially as delineated as a boxing ring. The winner defeats the loser, imposes a political settlement, the war ends. And that's what war is. I realized very quickly in Ukraine this is not war. I mean, we've known it a little bit. We saw obviously here was sort of the Balkans, you have essentially paramilitaries running around. It was all very chaotic, but you still had, you know, a certain ending of sorts. Now, what I saw in Ukraine was very different. Back then, right? In 2004, it was clear that Putin wanted Crimea. If you look at, you know, the Russians, they always wanted Crimea. There was always a thing about Crimea. No Russian I ever met before wanted Donetsk. We had to know what it was, and I've been there. Believe me, it's not as nice as Crimea. So what I saw in 2014 was something very interesting. I saw soldiers going into eastern Ukraine, but there was no attempt back then, right? Bear in mind this changes last year, but back then there was no, I don't think, like, what does he want here? There's no attempt to, like, go to Kiev, raise the Russian flag over the Rada, you know, impose a political symbol, you're going to annex it to Russia. He was doing something different. What he was doing was, like, he didn't want to defeat Ukraine militarily, he wanted to destabilize it to the degree that it could never join the EU or NATO. If you remember, Maidan kicks off because Yanukovych, the Russian-backed dictator, refuses to sign the EU accession agreement. So I'm sitting there in eastern Ukraine and I'm seeing all these tanks, and I mean, it's only tanks, but I'm seeing what are essentially Russian, I mean, fired on by Russian soldiers, or Russian artillery at least. But the goal, I realise, is not to militarily defeat Ukraine, I say to destabilise it so it can never join the EU or NATO. That is a political, not a military goal. And I sort of would think that typically, we've always thought that information operation propaganda supported military operations on the ground. What I saw then was military operations on the ground supporting propaganda operations, essentially online and in cyberspace. And this is when we started to see, and like now they dominate our public sphere. But back then, you know, I was watching Twitter. I mean, Twitter became several things. First it became a sort of a news feed, then it became my map. If I wanted to know which town or city to go to, I'd look at Twitter, I'd look at the BBC. But I realised something, that there were two wars being fought out, right? One with, you know, tanks and guns and soldiers, and the other with tweets and posts and shares. And for the immediate purposes, the tweets and posts and shares are becoming more important. Now, I need to be very clear about this. You know, this is not to say, people sometimes say to me, because of the book that emerged from it, to tell us how the war on the ground is not the most important one anymore. Obviously, the war on the ground is the most important one. That's where things happen. But what I realised is that war doesn't change in the sense that if Alexander the Great was risen from the dead and he looked at what was happening, he could understand, right? The hardware is incredibly different, but the fundamentals remain the same. The context within which wars are fought are very, very different. And it allowed back then Putin to essentially undertake military operations to support a much wider political goal. Now, Clausewitz said, God, I mean, this has been badly translated so many times, but to all intents and purposes, you know, war is the continuation of policy, politics, whatever, by other means. What I saw in Ukraine was war as armed politics itself. And that's different. It is a qualitative difference, and it's more dangerous because politics never ends and war never ends. As I say, we think of war as being like you're pregnant. You either are or you aren't. You're not a little bit pregnant. You either are or you aren't. It's not how it exists, you know. War now, that, you know, if today, for example, a soldier is killed in Iraq, are they a victim of the Iraq war or not? The answer is we don't know, and I think that's kind of the point. You know, I spoke to British soldiers who fought in Afghanistan, and they said, look, in the beginning our goal was to defeat the Taliban. In the end, our goal was to convince the local population not to join them. That's not a military goal, it's a political goal, and it doesn't end. So 2014, when I started this, was quite a year. We had the Ukraine war, we had Operation Collective Edge, Israel and Gaza, Israel and Hamas, well, they went to win Gaza. We had ISIS exploding. They took Mosul, Iraq's second city then. And then we had Ebola. I mean, it was a miserable time. I was looking at my Twitter feed, I wanted to hang myself. And I remember speaking to a friend and saying, well, this is just your fault. My Twitter feed's just full of Man United. But it was all this kind of stuff, and I was seeing these kind of conflicts that they were not what I've been sort of led to believe or taught to understand conflict to be. And you know, this is something, again, I then looked at Protective Edge. Now, this has kind of become relevant again. So when Israel and Hamas go to war, it's an interesting thing because the military result, I want to be very careful when I say it, the military result is predetermined, right? Israel cannot be defeated by Hamas, you know, and Israel will not be defeated by Hamas, and the Jews will not be thrown into the sea. Israel, whatever it says now, isn't really going to be able to completely eradicate Hamas. So these two sides fight when the military result is predetermined. Now we'll talk about later what happened now on the 7th of October. But this is kind of interesting because wars are fought on several levels. There is the military level, but there is also a discursive or political level. By which I mean, if you go to war, you have to make a political argument. If you lose the political argument, it's very bad. So Iraq, for example, the political argument in the end was lost. There were no WMDs. And because the political argument was lost, it became a total disaster. Now there's an argument to be able to say if the war on the ground had been prosecuted a bit more successfully or was more successfully, maybe it wouldn't have mattered so much. The fact is it wasn't, and as soon as it became clear that, or it was perceived that the arguments were totally bogus, the whole thing fell apart. Now, America is, the most powerful country in the world. Israel is a powerful country, but it still needs to win that little line because it needs to get arms, it needs to get cover in the Security Council. When you start to lose that, discursive battle, then it becomes much more problematic for Israel. And this is where Hamas and Israel becomes very interesting, because this is kind of the paradoxical logic of much of war. Sometimes, look at Napoleon marching on Moscow. The more battles Napoleon wins, the more successful he is, the more he becomes further and further from his own lines, the weaker he gets. The more the Russians lose, the more they fall back, the stronger they get. And this is a bit like Israel and Hamas. The more Israel succeeds in destroying Hamas and destroying Gaza militarily, the worse it gets for Israel politically. The more Hamas loses, the stronger it gets discursively, let's say. In the end, Hamas, as I said, cannot take out the IDF. So in the end, what does it do? It can only brandish its own corpses and hope that the world will intervene. It's a very paradoxical thing. So we have a similar kind of thing where the battlefield obviously is where the horror is, where things have fallen out, but the surrounding arenas become that much more powerful and much more potent. And that's when you get things like information, that's when you get things like those images, and that's when you get things like social media becoming incredibly, incredibly important. And I think that's an increasing way in which wars are fought and wars are prosecuted and wars are consumed. What is the degree to which Israel will, take account of everything that's going on around it? I don't think it's going to stop it from achieving its military goals, but I know, having long experience with the IDF spokesperson's unit and the political discussions that arise as a result, it's something they have to be aware of. Israel understands that every day this war goes on more, it benefits Hamas more at the discursive level, the political level, and it weakens them. Already have this thing of, pressing for a ceasefire and Israel talking about little mini ones. So I find that very, very interesting. When I was in Israel last week, I went to that. I think you all know that they put on, I went to that. They put on 45 minutes of unvarnished footage of what happened. The reason they did this is because people were saying it didn't happen. What I saw and I wrote about this was fairly horrific, and I've seen quite a lot of things, as all these gentlemen have as well. But it was done because, we live in an age in which the public sphere used to be an accretion of newspapers and magazines and channels, and it still is. But it's also now dominated by algorithmically curated platforms in which the metrics of what is privileged are completely changed. So to give you an example, if you tweet, if you have COVID, get a vaccine, isolate, and you'll get better. And you get 10 retweets. And I tweet, don't get a vaccine, it'll make you gay, and go and speak to everyone you can. And I get 100 tweets. It's a more successful tweet. It does not matter that yours is true and mine's nonsense. It's a more successful tweet. So we have these platforms that are constitutionally geared towards virality. Okay, so this is my point. And the thing about virality, the thing about truth, it's generally quite nuanced. Okay, take anything, immigration. Well, on the one hand, on the other, no one wants to read your 20-thread tweet on the nuances of truth. They just want, all Mexicans are rapists, or whatever. I know he didn't tweet, he said it in tweeting. So we have this public sphere in which other things are privileged, one of which is conspiracy theory. When I started in journalism, I'm not that old, but people used to talk about nutters writing into the newspaper in green ink, right? This is idea that you're mad and you wrote, what you're saying is nonsense, the Milanis didn't happen, fine. You sent it in. You're a nutter, you could be ignored. Now you go online, there's 5,000 other of you, and you're not a nutter anymore, you're a movement, and it's much harder to ignore. Journalists, people jump all over my tweets, I don't really care, but it does bother some people, I can understand it. So we get to a situation where, the IDF has to come out. And it's not as if everything was taken on trust either. Bear in mind, there was a lot of footage out there done by the perpetrators, by the way, which I find incredibly interesting. There's another thing that we talk about now, which I call gamification of terror. I'm looking at these video footage, and these are GoPros strapped to Hamas terrorists. And if you've ever played video games, you have that view of the gun doing it's exactly the same thing. We saw the thing with ISIS where they would use Western tropes, video games, jihadi, cool, all this stuff. You're seeing the same things here, but we have a thing where a state has to come out and essentially put out and essentially show more or less everything. And bear in mind, there's a lot they didn't show. Certain things around rape and stuff where the victims are still alive, you obviously cannot show. But it really struck me. I remember thinking, it was quite depressing in a sense that we had to come out, and be shown this, and it was also instructed that we couldn't take any recording equipment in, so we were shown it, but we weren't allowed to film it. So I think when we think about war now, it's a tendency or a temptation to get carried away. Like, none of this stuff is new. You talk about, if you sit at these moans about people believing nonsense instead of trying to sort of, none of these things are new. But the communicative modes that we have now mean that existing trends, the trends that always existed have become energized, empowered. And the role of the journalist, is the same, it becomes that much more problematic. There's all sorts of other things as well. You fall into echo chambers, and there's a myth that says, oh, you're always in your echo chamber, you only see what you agree with. Actually, not true, it's worse than that. You see what you agree with, the most extreme views of your opponent. So it makes everything worse. They call it nutpicking. You just pick the worst of your opponent. So the role of journalists becomes more difficult, becomes more problematic in the sense that no one believes anything you say, depending on their prejudices. These are part of broader trends anyway. I mean, and this is a much broader thing I don't really talk about, but since the turn of the century, more or less, we've seen the systematic discrediting of the institutional pillars of our society. So, and I'm not being hyperbolic here. Look at the Iraq War. The politicians' lives, the middle class is discredited. In England, we had the phone hacking things, journalists discredited. We had, in 2008, the bankers were all crooks. Then we had the Snowden revelations, the security services spying on us. So politics, finance, security, media, everything discredited. At the same time, you get this incredibly destabilizing technology. We all know it, the analogy of the printing press and the destabilization that follows. TV and radio in the 20s, Mussolini and Hitler used radio, particularly, in the 30s. We're in a similar period now. And, at the center of all this in conflict, or the center, not the center, but on the peripheries of the conflict are war correspondents. And I think when you are a war correspondent now, for me anyway, there's two things you have to take account of. You always have to be more important that sits at the center of the writing about things, what you're seeing, and the communicative modes in which it is communicated. Those October the 7th massacres were really instructive. They were a horrific terror event, but make no mistake, they were designed to be a media event as well. Everything was that footage is not coming out from one or two terrified sites, all coming out from the perpetrators. It was a media event as much as it was a terror event. We need to go together. And as a result, you have a dual responsibility, or I feel it anyway, to understand the way to the degree that you can that both things work, because they interact organically with each other and they affect each other. And ultimately, unless you are in Ukraine or Gaza, the only way you're seeing this stuff is how it is communicated to you, how it is mediated. And that's become ever more problematic. And I think that's where I'll leave it. That's my takeaway from this. Thanks.
Well, David, thank you very much for jogging our brains away, for shaking our brains away. So let's go to our third panelist, Mr. Puljić.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, my name is Ivica Puljić. I'm from Bosnia and Herzegovina. Lived here for last 28 years. And I'd like to thank David because I have discovered something about myself. First, I have COVID. Second, I'm gay. And then I don't have COVID. And yeah, it's when you're in this situation, you talk with your colleagues and immediately friends, and your memory is very active. And now, of course, my memories will be always connected the most with my days in the city Sarajevo. Sarajevo was, as you know, under the siege almost 4 years, under the Serbian siege. And what happened in that time? As a young journalist, TV journalist, I was first in Romania. I remember Ceausescu time and everything. And then that was the first time I saw street fights, Then I was in Kosovo, then I was, after Yugoslavia fell apart, in Slovenia, in Croatia. And then war came to your house, to your home. It's totally different approach, how you as a journalist is doing your job. For me, it was, I have decided I'll be professional and patriot. I couldn't divide that, because you have to be patriot in this situation when you're defending your home. Somebody tried to kill your kids, you are journalists. And that was pretty tough. And I have to say that as a domestic journalist in the war conflict, some people don't trust you, people outside, I would say, of Sarajevo, Bosnia and Herzegovina, what they tell me. Like Western journalists allegedly discovered that concentration camps in Western Bosnia, Serbian concentration camps, so much time, blah, blah, blah. But actually, it was that our TV station broadcasted 1 month before they discovered that, almost same footage. We got that footage through United Nations officer who was our liaison for the rest of Bosnia because we couldn't move from Sarajevo. We broadcasted that, but we were told, you know, you are one part of the conflict. You are part of the conflict. We cannot trust you. You know. And that is just one example. I tell also that as a TV journalist, that TV journalism in the war is really tough, you know, because you are exposed. You're exposed to bullets and shrapnels and everything. But the real heroes are always forgotten. Cameras. Camera people. They are real heroes, you know. We are talking about journalists, reporters and everything. But I always like to talk about camera people. They are so much exposed, you know, more than anybody else. As a reporter, I can hide a little bit, you know, peek what is happening. He must be totally exposed with his camera. We lost 36 people in the first year, 1992, as a radio TV station, 36 people. We stopped count bombarding and shelling and grenades after we count 1,000 grenades what hit our building radio TV station. Just first year. It's just stopped. We said, we don't need to count anymore. You know. But still, you have one part in the conflict. The war just didn't believe you, didn't trust you as a source, and didn't trust your information. That was pretty tough for us. But thanks to, I would say, Croatian TV, we made some very strange contact connection to Croatian TV, and then we sent to them, and then they sent to a broader territory. That was, I mean, Sarajevo is a really unbelievable story. And of course, that paramilitary forces were present, you know, especially the first year. After that, it was something better situation. But we have almost, I don't know, every street had the military or paramilitary forces, you know. Sometimes you didn't know who is there, who is not there, why. I know it was pretty much tough, you know. And they made mistakes. Even we were under bombing all the time, sniper fire all the time, no food, no electricity, no water, no fuel. But sometimes people are almost, I can say, they are paramilitaries in first part of the war. They made mistake. They just took somebody from the apartment because it was Serbian or Croat, you know. And as a journalist, I was very eager to stop that and to broadcast that situation. I remember very well that in our new show, when I was anchorman, I just asked the paramilitary forces to to release one doctor who was served by name, to release him because he's needed to, as a surgeon in the hospital. They took him from his house with no reason. Fortunately, people in Sarajevo, they were unbelievably helpful. They didn't like that behavior. And people in Sarajevo were really great heroes in that war, you know. They raised their voice and they said, "We are not like them. We are not like them." And that was just one part of my memories from Sarajevo. That's it.
Well, thank you all for very thought-provoking comments. I'm going to ask a few questions, and we'll take them in order. I want each panelist to answer them individually, and we'll take them in order. So the first question is, what do you consider to be the most important contribution of journalists covering wartime situations? So we'll start out with you, Manuela.
I think it's the position where you can shed light on really what's going on. If you, for instance, television journalist, I was working for television throughout the war in Croatia. So I was daily editor of the news shift when bombs fell in Zagreb from so-called Republic of Srpska Krajina as a retaliation for the action taken at the beginning of the May of the 1995, which basically brought back the Western Slavonia from the Serbs. So it was tragic, but you know, I felt what I could do as a daily editor of the daily television news. So I sent my crews on the field, and we basically, I think there were up to 6 or 7 people dead in Zagreb with the bombings. We were on the scene, and one of my colleagues, female colleagues, found the parts of the cassette phone. You know, they call it like a small part that partly explode after it. Because she didn't know what it is. She picked up one and said, "Look, this is what we found." You know, it's unbelievable thing. She was very happy not to be blown away. But those images of despair of the people, those atmosphere that we can present almost live, it's something that we could have contributed at the time. You know, we are on the scene. We don't make comments. We knew who did it. We know why they did it, but we just released the picture on air. The second thing, what I was invited a couple of days after by the Croatian military forces to go on the field with them to see what's going on really in Western Slavonia. I was one out of, I don't know, 15 journalists from Croatia. But those things are, as my colleague said, it's prearranged partly. So, you know, you're allowed to see certain amount of people, certain amount of streets, you can interview them, you know, and there were some Serbs staying there, and so what they may say, you know, they can say, you know, we are treated very well, you know, we are thankful that we could stay, etc. But it's always at these sort of times, if you are able to witness on the field activities, it's always good just to paint the picture, just to show what's really going on, and afterwards, because there is no room for comments as things goes on in real time. What makes difference between television and written journalism? So it gives you completely another perspective. It gives you all sort of space to dig in deeper, to explain, and to put things in much wider context. So then this is the sort of media where you can contribute by put some context in, to try to educate, not only to inform, but to make the explanation what's going on. So to be able to explain really manipulations on the field throughout the war, and especially afterwards in Croatia. So, because the wartime was not only 1991 and 1992, it was 1995, 1997 in Croatia, especially Bosnia and Herzegovina. These times, when you can explain really what's going on, right? When you can give some as an added value, this I feel my possible best contribution to this question.
So we're expanding the conventional definition of journalism to telejournalism, to the impact of television on this situation. David?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think my colleague has said most of it. I mean, fundamentally, you bear witness, right? This is what we do, we bear witness, we record it to the degree that we can. I think it's really quite simple in the end. You know, within that, I say that perhaps try and elucidate some of the broader trends that we're seeing that people need to understand, for example, the media, how it's changing, and how it affects their consumption, their understanding of what it is we're relaying and what they're seeing on TV. But in the end, all of us, and whatever we do, we bear witness and try and record, as I say, the first draft of history. I think that's really simple for me.
Yeah, I don't know, maybe just simple telling the story. I think that is the biggest thing. The importance of press coverage of our conflicts cannot be overstated. Journalists carry out a crucial mission of public interest. It's often thanks to journalists, you know, that serious human rights violations, war crimes, or other atrocities brought to the light. I think that's the most important thing, our biggest contribution.
So let's get a little more specific and personal. What is your own personally most important contribution as a result of your reporting from active duty military zones?
I'm not able to talk about my personal contribution reporting from the war zone itself, because at the time I was young and I was not on the field afterwards. I was around 22, 23 at the time, and I was reporting from the lines in Croatia. But I will extend it to this wartime reporting is not only first lines happenings. You know, I think that what I contributed most is basically explaining what's going on in this field of covering the real role of Croatian politics in Bosnia in the mid-90s, when we wrote about it, when we unveiled what was going on and published these Secret Service reports to shed some light, real light, what was the real role of the politics in Bosnia at the time. I think I find it more difficult.
Look, I mean, I don't really think it's my place to say, I'm not keep kind of saying that what I've done in particular, but I would say that in my career, perhaps I've tried to be just one more voice, make people, you know, bring conflicts to the distant back home to people that they need to understand. In our age, I don't believe personally that the foreign is actually that foreign. If you don't believe Ukraine affects this country domestically, if you don't believe Russia does, if you don't believe Israel and Gaza do, I think that's a mistake. So just one more voice in terms of that.
Okay, one example, in March 1992, in Bosnia and Herzegovina, I filmed Yugoslav army truck, actually 3 of them. They are helping Serbian paramilitary forces in northern part of Bosnia and Herzegovina, Bosanski Brod, town, Bosanski Brod. Actually, that was first recording, first proof, that we proved whose side they were on, because they are saying all the time, we are not, this side, this side, that side, blah, blah, blah. They were lying, of course, but we feel that, 3 Yugoslav army trucks that are helping military forces in northern Bosnia. Actually, they capture us and put us some village close to the town, keep us like 2-3 hours, threatening to kill us, and etc., etc. But that kind of a contribution, I think, is very important for people around.
Okay, thank you. As a result of the wide reach of the internet, any blogger can be a journalist and disseminate news on social media. What is the role of all these independent actors in reporting on conflicts?
So they can influence a lot, not a certain amount, a lot of people, but basically, it all, things are pretty simple. It's always crucial to know how to divide what's important, what's not. And this is where the media comes in again as a reliable source of information. So those guys can influence, but they can, especially in terms of manipulation. We heard at the first speech this aspect that you need to check on the source. So social media is open to manipulation. There are very skilled individuals, they can do manipulation. So what we did, what I faced personally a couple of years ago, not in terms of war, but in terms of the huge potential manipulation, is that a source which was known to me previously brought me the manipulated photos of then, at the time, Vice President of the government in highly intimidating context. So it took me a couple of days to dig deep and to find out that it was the manipulation. But we published this anyway, but we put it into the context because we find this is the important, because it shows new ways what people are ready to do to manipulate for various reasons. So it's extremely important not to double check, just to check and check and check it over as fast as possible nowadays. So it's better, some people say in Croatia, we read Nacional website because you don't run out of 200 news per day. You just put up to 51, and you know what's important is there and it's checked. We can rely on it. So it's up to the media itself, it's up to the individual himself who to believe or not. So
Sure.
it's this ability to see what's to realize what's really important or not makes all the difference between the media and the level of influence that you do.
Yeah, I mean, look, on principle, obviously, I'm against anyone that threatens my job. But I think, look, it's kind of a double-edged thing. Everyone, essentially, what does social media do? You strip it down, what does it do? Two things. It mobilizes people and it amplifies and broadcasts messages. So anyone with a Twitter feed or a blog can become theoretically a journalist. So there are problems with that. Obviously, maybe they don't have training. They don't have editors, so they don't have anyone who at least checks their work. So sure, you know, on the flip side of that, you have had the rise of, you know, this OSINT amateur OSINT community. In my book, I profile Higgins, the Bellingcat people, who essentially prove that Russia provides the book missile that shoots down AH-17. And, you know, he does it all with open source information. It's quite extraordinary if you look at what he does. Back then, anyway, it's like working out the time of day the missiles fired from shadows in photos. You can go online and get a map called SunCalc or something, which will tell you the time of day from the shadows. And you know, it's not as if the CIA and MI6 didn't know what happened, but the point is you could lay it out and you could prove it step by step. But you can't. So I think it's a bit of a double-edged sword. You know, the more crowded things become, the more people sort of jostling and squeaking and saying that this is the truth and publishing stuff, especially when it's not curated in any way by an editor or a third party, is problematic. But I think it's just a broader symptom of the public sphere we have. Back in the day, it was all about hiding information. You can't hide information now, really. Now you drown people in it. You can dispatch assassins to Salisbury Plain to whack a dissident, and a geek on the internet will find their GRU identities. You know, you can try and assassinate the most famous dissident in your country, and someone will prank call him and talking about the guy's underpants. You know, this is where we are now. You can't hide. You know, it's about whistle not blowing, but whistle drowning. So I think it's just another symptom of the same effect of the world we live in now. It's something that we're going to have to manage. And I think there's good points and there's bad points, like everything.
Yeah, it's a tricky question. Internet is, of course, one of the greatest discoveries in human history, but it can be a big problem actually when you use internet. When internet is in the wrong hands, you know. Internet has made it possible for everyone to be sports managers, economists, and journalists. Likewise, bad guys can now publish fake news with far-reaching consequences. That is a big problem, and Matthew said a few examples in his introduction of this panel, and David spoke about that today. It could be extremely dangerous, you know, because people want to believe what they want to believe. Yeah. You know, you can tell them this and that, they believe what they want to believe. I remember very well when I was in Slovenia, that was the first Yugoslav war, and then when you're on the field, you see that, you know, from inside, not just from outside. Then Croatia, I was covering also Croatia as a journalist. When I coming back, you know, I come back to Sarajevo, I was telling people, war is coming to our house. Then I said, oh, no, they were rejecting that kind of information. They called me even warmonger, you know, etc., you know. It was pretty tough, you know, to convince people that be prepared, it's coming, because they didn't believe. And now, can you imagine, we didn't have internet at the time, of course, but can you imagine now that you can put whatever you want on Twitter, as you said. Twitter has a big impact, you know, on public opinion. You can put whatever you want in Twitter, they will rather believe some stupid sentence than you as a real source of information. That's the problem.
And to bring it down to the present, what's your evaluation of the role of the international media in the situation in Gaza?
It's as usual as in similar situations as well. So they basically release the available stuff on TV or within the printed media, and it's as my colleague here said, it's more and more becoming the clash of narratives.
A clash of
narratives. And and this is where the context becomes nowadays more and more important, because it's completely obvious what started this series, unfortunate events a couple of weeks ago. But then from various perspectives, then they start to push in more and more context. So, you know, there were media spreading the news, but it didn't start today. You know, it lasted for etc. etc. So the media is a very wide range of the source of the various information which covers this issue, and you can more and more choose from which outlet you want to hear what you like to hear. So the media impacts a lot, but it can change, it can influence, of course, but it's very hard to say what's the crucial role, who influenced the more, what types of information or following stories influence in what regard. So there is it's observed in a way. If you talk about censorship, there is no censorship. You have social media, so you cannot hide any kind of information. It's just a question how you will understand it and how you are going to put it out. So, so it's the new reality. It's more complex to understand when you talk from the perspective of the public. It's more and more complex. It's harder to understand really the positions of the various sorts of outlets. But when you talk to the politics, they will choose what to read, what to see, and they will address to what they want to hear. So you cannot describe it, you cannot give an indefinite one true answer to this question. What was the role? The role is multiple. No, it depends from what side you're taking a look at it.
Sure. So, goal specifically, I'll go back to the point I made earlier. The clash of narratives is absolutely correct. I wrote about this extensively. And bear in mind, when the Axis and Allies fought, it was touch and go for a while. Nobody knew who was going to win. We know who's going to win on the ground. So it's about whose narrative will win out in the end. That's really important because, as I said, when we talk about comms and information, right? Look at Zelensky's a really good example here because remember at the beginning of last year he was this hero and everything, the way he communicated. And actually, I think in many ways he reordered the image in our mind of what an early award he should be. I talk about digital statesmanship and the glamour of rhetoric, but that of wartime rhetoric now, this sort of digital age. But the point I'm making is this: is that standing up and speaking is not going to win the war on the ground, but it will get you javelins and stingers and envelopes that will chew up the Russian army on the ground. And Poroshenko was the incumbent. In many ways, a more serious man than Zelensky back then. Zelensky is a man who, 10 years ago, was playing piano with his penis, which, by the way, gives everyone hope he can become president one day. He does that. The footage is there. But the point is, he knew how to communicate. Now, if Poroshenko had been if a Ukrainian president had stood up and said, last night, struck Odessa, 10 children killed, it wouldn't have had the same effect. And I spoke to EU diplomats, American diplomats, said it made it very, very difficult for us to ignore the Ukrainian cause. So information is not, it affects the war on the ground. So when the battle is predetermined on the ground between Gaza, between Hamas and Israel, the clash of narratives becomes really important because it's what, in the end, these narratives that will ultimately, perhaps, decide how this pans out longer term. Obviously, the immediate results are Israel will do what it does, and Hamas will suffer accordingly, and so on and so forth. But if Hamas emerges out of this with Gaza destroyed and Israel an international pariah, it has achieved a goal. And it's the only goal it can achieve because it cannot militarily defeat Israel. So it becomes even more important.
Yeah, Gaza, yeah, we talk about that. We have some example with hospital and the babies and everything. It's very clear that it's clash of narrative. But what I don't like over there to see the last few days, the TV crews ride in Israeli tanks and enter in Gaza in that way, And after that, they can publish only what passes Israeli censorship. That is not journalism, in my opinion. Of course, I'm very sure that censorship inside of Gaza itself is very strong, probably stronger than the Israeli side. But over there, most journalists live, they have kids, they work there, and they're dying over there. That is unbelievable how many journalists died in just 1 month. More than 40 of them. Mostly Palestinians, but also 4 or 5 Israeli journalists were killed. It's unbelievable. But I don't like that. We saw that first time, I think, in the Iraqi war, if you remember, when American journalists went inside Iraq on American tanks and everything. Of course, that every army we want to see what you did, what you record, and that is some kind of natural censorship in the war. But as a journalist, I don't like that approach. Embedding, yes, exactly.
Well, let's take a look at the questions from the audience, please.
May I come first, Robert? Sean, and then you. Thank you all. David, I have a question for you. Just came from Israel and Gaza. You can tell us more of atmospherics, the people, the highs and lows. For Israel, this was I think it has changed the way Israelis are going to live. I think it's more monumental. We can talk politics, but imagine 1,400 people slaughtered. You made a very good point. It was done. We can speculate whether it was because Saudis were approaching the peace agreement with Israel, which was pretty much advanced, including with the nuclear peace technology, which Netanyahu was against, but it was overcome. So we were about again, sort of recall the time when I used to live in Jerusalem, it's like Rabin time, when he was assassinated. But in a different narrative, there is a whole different, with Abraham Accords, reality in the Middle East, which I think is good for the people in the wider region. So we can speculate the reasons, but that was what you pointed out. It was purposely recorded to win media, or it backfired on Hamas. But now, what Ivica says, yes, you have these hospitals, you have playgrounds, you have Hamas in a certain way preventing people to leave, and I want you to comment on this because you were there on all of this.
This is very interesting.
Because I think at the end of the day, this is where poor Palestinian people does become a victim of an organization that is rightly so labeled as a terrorist organization. So the question is, where do you see this conflict going? How do you see ramifications?
Yeah. So look, there's a lot of questions there, but they're the right questions, and I want to take them in turn. I'm not sure that, I find this really interesting. Look, when you say backfire on Hamas, let's say in the beginning of the Russia-Ukraine invasion last year, I was watching RT, there was nothing. They weren't even attempting to make the case. Like in 2014, every day you'd see them on Nazis in Ukraine. And everyone was saying, well, the Ukrainians, meanwhile, in 2014 were getting killed information. But last year, the Ukrainians, all the memes, everything, Zelensky was on fire. And everyone said, well, Russia lost the media war. Well, it hadn't. It was starting to fight it everywhere else. In Africa, it was really doing it. And what Hamas did was so egregious. And they are not, Palestinians are not media unsavvy, they're not stupid. And I started to wonder if maybe they're just a different audience. Maybe they just have given up slightly on the West now. And we have this thing where there are other players in town, Iran, Russia, all these other things. And maybe they were willing. Look, for a start, I don't think they ever thought it would be that successful. You said to me, you started this saying, what's the mood like? Forget the politics. The answer is traumatized. Like, I was sitting in that video session, and forget for a minute all the atrocities. I'm watching hundreds of Hamas terrorists walk across roundabout, walk down the street. If you're Israeli, you're like, Jesus Christ, like, the security failing is monumental here. Look, Israel is a country born from trauma, founded in trauma. Trauma exists quite close, I would say, the Israeli side. They're traumatized people. Look, it wasn't just a video session, it was also, the guy stood up from the IDF. At one point someone said, one of the judges rightly said, how could this happen? And the general, and I think it's Mickey Eaglestein, he said we failed, and just worked. Hamas have all these tunnels, and the Israelis built this barrier, this really sophisticated subterranean barrier. They just cut through the wires with $20 bolt cutters. And not only that, you had Hamas terrorists there 10 hours before the IDF got there. I mean, you could drive from Eilat to E7. I don't know what they were doing. And some say now as well that a lot were taken from the southern border to guard settlers in the West Bank. And there's a lot of trouble brewing about that. But the answer to your question is traumatized. They're just traumatized, enraged, frightened, not timorous, but I mean it was just an extraordinary thing, and it is unprecedented in Israeli history. Now, by all laws of political gravity, if we look at the post-mortem after the Yom Kippur War, I mean, and sorry, just going back, I mean, they did it. Look when they did it. I mean, it was an extraordinarily good operation. Let's leave aside the whole thing. Look at really the IDF will say, I mean, they did it on the 50th anniversary. As my Israeli friend said, I sat here for a month watching films on Yom Kippur War saying, oh, we got caught with our pants down, that's never going to happen again, on Israeli domestic TV, and then this happens. It's very traumatic. I mean, I hope that, I had a friend and, he said, look, we got fat and lazy and addicted to tech. Now, I've no idea whether this is true or not, but this is what the reaction is. But there's going to have to be a reckoning after this internally. If you're talking about labs in Israel, you lived there, I've been there all my life, but I've never lived there, so you know better than me. But this is of a different order I've ever seen in this country. And rightly so. I mean, what was happened is absolutely unbelievable. And then, you talk about Hamas, look, Gaza is a place of 2 million people, and it is a place of civilians. It is, it just is. But underneath it, there are 500 kilometers of tunnels. Okay, it is a subterranean terror network. It just is. And this does not mean that Palestinians are terrorists or something nonsense. But Hamas. It's funny sometimes you hear people say, well, Hamas doesn't have an army or any bases or anything, and then say, well, why is Israel going into the cities? It's like, well, you've answered your own questions in your own question. And they do build tunnels on the hospital. They do. I mean, I'm sure you do, but you understand what we're talking about here when we talk about tunnels. You're not talking about a tunnel as you understand it. We've got tunnels you can drive a truck through. A few of those tunnels you drive cars through. They have munitions factories. There's this thing back in the day where they would smuggle prize racehorses into Egypt, from Egypt through this. At one point, back in the day, like the tunnels are an economy in Gaza. People club together to buy into tunnels. You invest in a tunnel. It was a third of the economy at one point. And we're talking about up to, and we don't know for sure, but let's say up to 500 kilometers of tunnels, because they crisscross, right? The lattice work under everything. I was going to go down once when I was in Gaza, but it didn't happen. So, tragedy is an overused word, but the truest sense of tragedy means where there are no good choices. That's what's tragic, and this is just tragedy. Like, it's just, I find it, in fact I'm Jewish or whatever, but I find it a very, very, very hard conflict today, because, look, the Palestinians are suffering, right? Now, a lot of that is down to Hamas as well, but it's, you go to the West Bank and you see what people are doing there on the other side, it's not great. I find it a very, very hard conflict to cover. And I think they're traumatized. I hope that there is an internal reckoning that ensures something like this from a security point of view doesn't happen again. But in terms of what's going to happen with Gaza, I don't know. Like, there's this idea Hamas will never govern it again to pose such a threat, but then you govern it. They really want to occupy it, I don't think. So the idea of something they can't take control of it again. So,
Sure. And if you just have an annex question, because we tweeted the other day from reporting from Gaza.
Yeah.
You attack harshly Jewish settlers in your West Bank, and you appeal to the Israeli government that they have to rein them in. And it was a message also from our Secretary of State here. And so you were, I guess, in close proximity.
Well, I went to the West Bank. Now, people don't have, look, leave aside the moral thing, these people stealing land has been really not theirs. They're also a strategic threat to Israel, and the IDF knows it. most anti-settler stuff I've heard in Israel comes a lot of the time from the IDF that have to go on. You know, it is problematic, and you need to watch the West Bank as well, because West Bank is, the tensions are rising massively. We have people, you know, we have lots of family members killed in Gaza, because, you know, they are one people. We have a section of settlers who are actually using this as an opportunity to try and push forward. And, you know, we have, bear in mind, there's another thing about Israel that people don't realise, and you'll understand. Tel Aviv is like not a ghost town, but nothing's working. Like my taxi driver's like when I'm a tour guide usually, there's no work. Like they're suffering economically. They shut the West Bank, there's Palestinians every day who rely on, thousands who rely on money from Israel. They're not working either, so there's a serious problem brewing here. And if that blows up as well, that's, as well as the tragedy that will unfold there, it's a serious problem for Israel, and more so than Gaza, because you can't lock it down to the same degree, obviously. So, you know, there's problem mounting on problem here. And then you have obviously the internal stuff, which has primarily brought some unity, but it's incredibly problematic. My message here is do not forget about the West Bank. Watch the West Bank.
Yeah, so, you know, back in the day, when I did my hazardous environment training at the BBC, we were always taught to, that you wanted to identify yourself as a journalist. You know, you wear a big press, the roofs of the cars were marked. It seems to me, and it's a long time since I've been done any reporting from a war zone, that calculus might have changed, and that these days actually you can put yourself in a greater risk by identifying yourself as a reporter. And you know, we've seen individuals, you know, like Austin Tice and others, you know, go missing or be killed because they were reporters. And I wondered if anyone on the panel would like to reflect on that sort of changing calculation, really, and what it means and what it implies for you know, wartime reporting.
I've spoken enough, I just want to come back immediately, because funny enough, if you go to my Twitter, Patrikarakos, there's a tweet thread of when I went with a frontline unit to the zero contact line. So we're talking 100 meters from the Russians. We kind of ran through carrying a drone. I didn't run very far, but I panted mostly. But what's really instructive, this is right at the zero contact. We stand there, before we stay, he goes, David, and he just rips the press off and says, don't wear this, the Russians are literally targeting you. So he rips all the press stuff off me, deliberately, and then we go, and you can see it on there. And actually, funny enough, once he ripped the press thing off, my helmet was black, so they said I look like a racist. So they asked me to change that as well. That was immediately, as soon as we went right up to the Russians, they're like, get rid of all the press, because they were targeting you. So that's
Any other comments?
Wow, he explained it perfectly well.
Well, I'm afraid we've reached our time limit. So I'm sure that our panelists will be around and able to answer your questions, but I think we have a very, very good idea of the challenges and the consequences of the current situation and journalism's role in that. So thank you very much.
Can I just say something?
Yes, sir.
Very shortly. It's David, you're younger, much younger than me, and you're still on field all the time. I think the most important thing for a war reporter is to know how and when to stop the war report. You know, I got a lesson from an American journalist when I was in Slovenia, and he told me that. And I'm seeing what they're doing, you know, there's good stuff. Do you have family? I said, yeah, I have 2 kids. You know. Okay, I don't have anybody. I was in Vietnam, now I'm a veteran journalist. I don't have life, I don't have wife, I don't have kids, I don't have friends. I just have adrenaline. It's all what I have. Don't be like me.
Thank you, guys.